Hi, I'm Bruce Pattinson from the Total Education Centre. I hope you enjoyed today's lecture, and don't forget that these lectures are brought to you free. So if you give us a like, that'd be great, and don't forget, if you have any questions or any queries, click on the button below, write me a question, and we'll surely get back to you as quickly as possible. Don't forget, if you're a subscriber to our channel, you can get to select the videos that you want to have made, and if you really need some extra help, don't forget, go to our website, because on the website you have all the student notes and teacher notes for the topics that I'm lecturing on. These lectures are only in addition to those, and they'll give you all the detail that you require to do well in your studies. Thanks for watching, and we hope you enjoy the video.
Hello and welcome to today's lecture. Today I want to talk about some of the techniques used in Metropolis in 1984, but I just want to recap on some of the ideas that we talked about in previous lectures. The previous lecture we talked was power, and I talked about the linking the idea of power in those, and I'd just like to begin this lecture today talking about some more of those commonalities between the two. Obviously we're looking at a dystopian and utopian future, depending on the aspect that you look at it in different ways, and I'll come to that a little bit later on. But the first commonality that I would like to touch about would be the idea of revolution and rebellion in both texts, and how revolution and rebellion are keywords that you can utilize when you're looking at some of the commonalities between the two texts, both of which obviously can be found in both texts, but in very different ways. Personal rebellion and mob rebellion are evident in either of the two texts, and a certain sense of revolution, whether it be the physical sense of revolution where people actually go and riot as they do in Metropolis, or that quiet rebellion that Winston and Julia have in 1984. You can develop and build on those concepts if they're relevant to you, and you can also link them very clearly and closely to power, and I think that's a very good thing to do. And it gives you a little bit more to talk about in your essay, and it'll help it flow. Another perspective both texts share is the idea of counterpoint in the two texts. For example, hope and hopelessness. And you could look at both hope and hopelessness in both texts and engage in that in a very clear, concise and constructive way. A specific example for this might be the pacifist Maria and the robotic Maria, and the way that they handle both situations, and that's a lovely contrast, and you can talk about that when you use character as well. The interesting thing in 1984 is you might be able to contrast the idea of the sexuality of Julia and the way she has, and the idea of hate to release emotion, and that contrast between love and hate. And I think you could do something with both those and integrate those into both texts. What else can we look at? We can look at the use of propaganda in both texts, and use of looking at the way language is manipulated and held, and I want to go deeply into that towards the end of this lecture. But for now, just think about how Orwell uses things such as the Ministry of Truth, which isn't really about truth, and all those sorts of ideas. You can also look at, as a last link before I start talking about language, the use of memory in both texts, and how memory is manipulated and how people remember things, and you can focus on that as a link between the two texts as well. In these two utopian and dystopian worlds, we have lots of similarities and differences, and in the way that both creators envision the texts. That Orwell's vision is a bleak and mindless existence where every aspect is controlled by the state, and his purpose was to, as I'll explain to you later when we look at language in detail, the totalitarian regimes of his time, whereas Metropolis shows a future world where technology and machinery dominate, and there's an underworld. And you can link the idea of the underworld with the proles if you like to do that. And we see a clear demarcation in Metropolis between the elites and the workers down in the factories. The Orwellian vision of Landing Strip 1 and London in particular is that of urban decay and the essence of conformity and all those sorts of ideas. Lang's vision's quite different to Orwell's in some ways, but similar in the fact that they both have a darker side. Orwell's very bleak vision of the future, and Metropolis's the idea of the depths. And we contrast this with the Eternal Garden and the nightclubs and those sorts of things, and the different dress and all those ideas. So I think that's very important. Orwell's text too sort of starts out with language in a different way and manner. Orwell's vision was one where, and he talks about why he was writing. And in his essays he writes, "What I have wanted to do throughout the past 10 years is to make political writing into an art. My starting point is always a feeling of partisanship, a sense of injustice. When I sit down to write a book, I do not say to myself, I'm going to produce a work of art. I write because there is some lie that I want to expose, some fact to which I want to draw attention, and my initial concern is to get a hearing. But if I could not do the work of writing a book or even a long magazine article if it were not an aesthetic experience. And we've seen some criticism of Orwell's writing over time that it's very simple, but I think if you take that particular idea and extrapolate it into 1984, you can see the aesthetic qualities, and there are lots and lots of language techniques in Orwell's work, and it's not a simple process of writing for him. He's come to it with a very specific idea and he wants to manipulate that idea, and I think we can see that in 1984. And I think Orwell's work's probably more appreciated now than it was in the past. So what are some of the techniques that Orwell uses in 1984? I think the development of newspeak in that language is probably one of the greatest things that he does. In fact, he invents a new language for the novel, and it gives him some liberties to play with ideas and how he manipulates the terminology, and a lot of readers find it humorous in many ways, and there's certainly a sense of irony there and the ridiculousness of when he manipulates that newspeak. What else does he use? Of course, we have that deep symbolism. We can look at the symbolism of the prole woman, the telescreens, Big Brother, St. Clement's Church, the glass paperweight, the books, and the use of books and writing, and of course Room 101. We also have a sense of exaggeration and satire in it. Satire is the use of humour, irony or exaggeration or ridicule to expose flaws and issues in society. And I think Orwell does that very clearly, and there's lots of exaggeration and pathos in the text. Doublethink, the erasing of the past, people's loss of individuality, the names of the ministries, and ironic slogans such as war is peace, which people come to believe, that sort of oxymoron. And I think that's another technique that you might want to mention when you talk about and integrate these techniques in your thing. Don't just list them or slab them as sort of I've done here for you. Techniques in Metropolis are very different because of the nature of the text. And if we look at Orwell's piece of fiction versus the cinematic techniques that Lang uses. And I think Metropolis is seen now, again, much as Orwell, in a far more progressive light. And Louis Buñuel says, if we look instead into the compositional and visual rather than the narrative side of the film, Metropolis exceeds all expectations and enchants as the most wonderful book of images one in any way can imagine. Every scene in this film has been meticulously thought out. Of particular interest is the staging of the film. The workers live in a city deep below the surface of the earth. All the buildings in this underground city are colourless and all look the same, much as the workers do. In contrast, the upper class dwell high above, where beauty and opulence abound, given to lives of luxury and decadence, blissfully unaware of the misery below. And while that goes to setting, and there will be certainly another lecture on setting in this series, it's the idea, the composition and that contrast that we talked about previously, the idea of between hope and hopelessness that I talked about at the start of this lecture, that he brings it in. And I think Lang's technique is very clear, and the set that he builds is extremely intricate and meticulous. It's the photographic excellence of Metropolis that's been sort of talked about more recently, and certainly it's rated now as one of the great films of all time. And I think that excellence is best summed up in the quote by Boudid. And all the quotes that I'm giving you today are in our teaching notes and in the student notes. And you can go to the website and get the links to these and get the full quote. And there's lots of extra information in that. But I'll just talk to you about the idea of cinema. The best brief tribute that can be paid to the photographic excellence, directorial power and architectural form of Metropolis is to point out that, in spite of the great abridgments made to the substandard version, the shots still match in tone and composition. The force and fluidity of the direction cannot be lost, and the artistry of design triumphantly persists. But, above all, credit must go to the man in control who wielded each efficient production, phase into its place as a monument of cinematic power, which is why the film is often referred to as Metropolis, directed by Fritz Lang. And I think that quote sums it up pretty well. That Lang creates a world that we enter and we go into, and certainly the shots and the settings and scenes that he creates were amazing. And lots of the sets took months to build. Lots of the shots were done over and over and over again. The scene of the Tower of Babel is very, very specifically important. I mean, the flooding scene took ages to create and ages to develop. And the various techniques that he uses to draw us into the film, obviously there's things like tension with the heart machine, and the machine's always moving and stressing out the people. The dissolving montage that he uses to cut from scene to scene, the rapid cross-cutting to build excitement and tension, the idea of characters in huge spaces that make them seem so small and overwhelmed by the world, the direct looking into the camera, the close-ups, all those techniques that you really need to look at. Especially look down below when we move down to where the workers are, the use of lighting and the use of shadow. And I mean, obviously there's areas of grey there, but the light and the shadow and how characters are portrayed in particular ways with that use of light and shadow is very, very important. So there's a brief summary of the techniques and some of the other ideas in Metropolis. Don't forget, if you need any help with the questions or you have any other issues or need anything, let us know. We'll try and help you out. Stay tuned for future editions. Thank you very much for watching this today. I hope you've enjoyed it.